The Vikings impacted English in a huge way. When they colonized England, they changed the way we would speak forever. The English language adopted a lot of new words from the Vikings as well as new consonants. The Vikings changed our grammar by simplifying it after living with the native people in England for a long time. Vikings were ruthless and merciless masters of the sea, and their way of being led them to take over much of Europe. And even though the Vikings were the ones to wreak the most havoc there, they had the most positive long-term effects in that area. First, we should understand what factors led them to take over so much of Europe. First of all, there is the decline of the Frankish Empire. The Charlemagne's death invited raids because it was the death of a leader, which left them vulnerable. There was also overspending of Arab caliphs. Their overspending wrecked the trade in the Baltic Sea, which then forced Vikings to seek fortunes through more violent means. So basically, because they couldn't rely on trade to keep them going, they had to conquer. With the Frankish Empire declining, it opened up a door for them to do just that. Secondly, the growing population of landless younger sons also played a role in the Vikings wanted to conquer. These landless younger sons were looking for fortune and adventure. Good climate in the Viking community allowed for just that. Because of Viking customs of polygamy, which is being able to have more than one wife, and also primogeniture, leaving all inheritance to the eldest sons, the younger sons had to look for their own fortune. Also, a big factor in their success was the ships and navigation techniques. Vikings had a lot of different types of ships. They had dragon ships, the typical long ship, and the ocean-going stout ships. However, all of the ships shared characteristics that made them very adaptable. Their ships could hold up to 200 men, but were often sailed only by 15. Their ships were also strong enough to travel rough seas, but yet light enough to be carried over river defenses and sailed through small rivers. The navigation techniques were a huge factor in their success. To people at this time, the techniques made them seem like crazy men, but they were effective. They had been passed down for centuries through sailors' lore. It was these oral traditions that safely got them through nasty waters. At around 800 AD, the Vikings set out to raid their neighbors and travel to distant lands to trade and settle. They weakened their enemies with raids and then earned status and plunder. These goods encouraged more and more raids to the point where this process became a cycle. The Vikings would raid, earn more goods, which made them want to raid more, and they would do it over and over again. As they became more victorious in their raids and their raids increased in size, the Vikings continued to raid and eventually go further through inland rivers. If they could not go further inland through the rivers, then they stole horses to carry them and their riches. As more raids happened, Vikings set up winter bases instead of returning home to Scandinavia because it was more effective. These winter bases then often became permanent settlements and the basis for their eventual conquest of that region. The actual raids consisted of many different things. The raids were made up of different atrocities committed by the Vikings to intimidate. One of the most common ways to intimidate was to destroy Christian churches. The Vikings showed no respect for Christian churches because the churches in Europe were wealthy and considered to be high standing. They were often the Vikings' first target. They would come and destroy the church and send a wave of fear through the people. They set out to conquer England in 1066 using the same method. Their conquest set up foundations for the modern nation. They took over 6 out of the 7 Anglo-Saxon states and had a continuous battle with Wessex, the last one left. The Vikings eventually left England, but not without leaving their mark.
Most of the outside influence on the English language happened a few centuries before the 1200s. This is because the Vikings arrived in the early 800s and the Norman conquerors arrived in 1066. During this time, the English language was adopting new words. The words officially became part of the English language when they were first written down. Some other language changes that the Vikings brought to the English language were 3 new consonant sounds, g, k, and sk, as well as simplifying pluralization and counting. There were also Norse words that were adopted into English. and now act as marker or tags added to things. Some examples are Thorpe and Thwaite, which are now added to the start or end of places as Thorpe and Waite. Some other words kept their meaning but developed a different connotation. For example, ransack used to mean an orderly search, but now it means to rob or steal. Words from Norse were part of the English language before 1200, but no one was writing them. In fact, Norse words were never written down as Norse words in Norse runes, but they were eventually translated into English. 200 years after the large addition of words, the pronunciation of vowels experienced a major shift where they softened and became closer to what we now know. During early modern English, Shakespearean English, a lot of new words and phrases were coined. Many of these phrases that now seem quite cliché were created by Shakespeare himself.
While the Vikings impacted the English vocabulary, their impact on English grammar was incredibly important. Between Old English and Middle English, there were dramatic simplifications in grammar. The switch to Middle English came with the Norman invasion, so the Normans were the original suspect for this change. However, this would not make sense as grammar could not have been changed by a small population of foreigners who barely interacted with the local population. The Norman impact on English had more to do with vocabulary. The Vikings were the ones who were in a better position to actually change the grammar of English.
John McWhorter argues that the French Normans did little besides add words. For one, there were never that many Normans in England, and those that were would not have had much contact with anyone but the elites. McWhorter says that even if you as a commoner had the chance to hear your leader talk, which would have been rare at the time, most likely you would not have changed how you talked just so you could sound like them. It was more likely the Vikings that really changed the grammar. The Vikings came in waves, with each group having to relearn English. Then, the Vikings, who had a bad understanding of English, would speak a sort of broken English and would pass that on to their children, so their children would speak a different English. This continuing relearning of English served to simplify English and to create a different dialect, Danelaw, which was the area of the Vikings' control.
But what exactly in our grammar comes from the Vikings? As mentioned, mostly what the Vikings did was simplify the language. When someone who spoke Old English met someone who spoke Old Norse, it was very likely that they would be able to understand the words that they were using. For example, the words for wagon, horse, and to pull were similar enough that a Norseman and an Englishman could generally understand what the other was talking about. However, what the Vikings struggled to understand and learn as adults was the grammar. For example, a Norseman wouldn't understand an Englishman's use of the word the, and might confuse how many of something there is. Usually, when there are enough situations like this, where the vocabulary overlaps but complexities in the grammar make it difficult to communicate, there is a good reason for a language to simplify. As discussed before, these two groups were living together in peace for generations, so a sort of natural pigeonization occurred and Old English became much simpler. Anyone who has tried to learn German or a Scandinavian language from an English point of view will no doubt notice that English grammar is somewhat simpler. Other European languages have various seemingly unnecessary quirks, such as gendered suffixes, using the reflexive to mark a bunch of verbs, and directional adverbs. We don't have these things in English, but Old English certainly did, as well as Old Norse. But between Old English and Middle English, many of aspects of grammar became much simpler, and this makes sense because of the way that people intermingled that we previously discussed. One example of simplification in English is the lack of gendered suffixes, with English being the only European Germanic language that does this. This was seen falling away from the language between Old English and Middle English in the northern parts of England where the Viking population was more dense, and learning adults could change the language that ended up being taught to the next generation. In addition, English became simpler because it stopped using the reflexive as frequently. For example, you would say, I have to go, while in another European language, such as Spanish, you would need to say, I have to go myself. It's not necessary to refer to everything you do to yourself by saying myself or yourself, so this is something that was taken out by new speakers of English over time. Also, English lost directional adverbs such as hither, tither, and whither. It also lost various pronouns for specific situations or referring generally to people, and began using you for a lot more things than other European languages. Both of these things were also elements in Old English, but that disappeared in the transition to Middle English that involved the Vikings.
No, the Viking rule in England dramatically changed the language. English adopted a bunch of new words as well as consonants from the Vikings. But the biggest change the Vikings brought was in the grammar. Because there are adults moving in and integrating with the local population, they passed down a sort of broken English to their kids, causing the language to be dramatically simplified over time, which is still evident in how simple English is. Thank you for watching.